Good morning, JSConf Budapest. Being the first speaker of the day, I have to be the one for today that points out once again how lucky we are to be standing in this, sitting in this venue, getting to listen to the brilliant minds of our day sharing things, and they will be coming up later, but until then, I'm going to talk for a few minutes. The title of my talk, as it says, is MVC, Mozart Violin Concerto versus Model View Controller. And you may be like, okay, old guy on stage, model view controller, that makes sense. The truth is I'm not going to mention model view controller probably even once. It just makes a really good pun with Mozart Violin Concerto. This is me. I'm from Vancouver and in Canada, though I was originally born in the States. Please don't hold that against me. I've been in Canada for 20 years. My current role is I'm head instructor of Lighthouse Labs, which is a software development boot camp. That means my job is to teach people every day about coding. I have been a web developer for 19 years. I remember when we still had like the Macromedia preload images rollover in JavaScript, like that was advanced JavaScript for a web page. I remember those days. But this is also me. I started off with a degree in music from Columbus State University in Columbus, Georgia, and my original goal in life was that I was going to perform in opera orchestras and ballet orchestras and musicals all around the world and live that kind of jet-set tuxedo life, and that was going to be my world. But interestingly, in 1998, I got introduced to the world of web development. Computers had always been a hobby of mine. I'd always loved using computers. And I found this web thing that people were talking about and using HTML and using what barely passed for CSS at that point. And I had a couple really good mentors who introduced me to what best practices were and how to get involved. And I found that the web was a perfect canvas. If I could imagine it, it could go on the screen. And that motivated me, that moved me, and my hobby and my career swapped places in the span of literally about 4 days. During which time I built probably the worst web page ever. It was purple, it had fish at the top, there was a big form where every input field was about this wide, on an 800 by 600 screen, of course. But I'm still an active musician. I perform principal horn with the Vancouver Pops Orchestra and a few other organizations in Vancouver, and it's very much a part of my life. And with something being that much a part of your life, you end up analyzing the ways in which you can get better in all the parts of your life. And I started to notice as I progressed some crossovers between music and technology. And they weren't just, the common ones like I listen to music while I'm coding. That's an obvious one. As I analyzed this, I realized that what I was searching for more than anything else is I was searching for a way for my music to make my technology better. And the creative side of me, the analytical side of me, started having a conversation, and if you've ever had that many voices in your head, well, you probably need medication, but I found some interesting parallels there, and so I figured this was something I could get up on stage and I could talk about because approach for us as developers is everything. But it is a tech presentation, so I have to have an obligatory GIF, so I wanted to get that one out of the way early. And I want to start off this morning with a little bit of culture, if the sound would play. Sound? That gives you a preview of what's coming up. No worries. I promised this worked about half an hour ago.
Can we go to the control panel? Oh. This one?
Yeah. Which is weird because it works before. Perfect. And now for some culture. That was the entrance for the violin soloist to the Mozart Violin Concerto No. 1. That's 15 seconds of your life that you won't get back, but it's 15 seconds of your life that you listen to something that you probably weren't paying attention to the fact that there was a tremendous amount of structure and technique and things going on behind it. You're just like, oh, hey, Mozart, first thing in the morning, not bad. But I want to take that clip, and I want you to now listen to it again in your head. I'm not going to play it again, but listen to it in your head again and think about the fact that there is a very solid structure there. There is a very definite set of technique that is being demonstrated there. And the reason I point these things out is because when we go to use a web application as consumers, because we're all consumers of the web as well as builders of the web, but when we go to use a web application, we don't think about the structure that's going on. When you sit down and you use Instagram or Facebook, you're not thinking about the load balancers, you're not thinking about the caching or the Redis sessions or whatever may happen to be going on behind the scenes. You're just using an app. And that's fine, and we think we might peel the curtain back and think about what's going on underneath. But music has that same structure. And so this usually brings up the question of who cares? Great, music has structure, gone, we knew that. But if I'm going to talk about these parallels, then I actually have to start pointing out some very specific areas where we should care. We as developers should care. And the reason is we as musicians and developers get to think similarly. Quick show of hands, how many of you have spent at least 1 year of your life either taking music lessons, playing in a musical group, singing in a chorus, something like that? Fair number. That's going to help me quite a bit. Users care. And the reason users care is because software and music are both a craft. If you go to the symphony and you are listening to Lang Lang or Yo-Yo Ma or Itzhak Perlman or any of the great performers of our day, you are seeing an absolute virtuoso, a craftsperson at work. Very similarly, when we go and we use a lot of the powerful and well-built apps that we use every day, we are seeing a craft at work. When we see someone up here live coding and we see the techniques that they are demonstrating, we're watching a craftsperson at work. That's impressive. And I would much rather eat at a Michelin star restaurant where the chef is a consummate master of their craft than at Burger King, for example. The craftsmanship of our work matters. And I say that you should care because I said earlier, approach is everything. If we can get better at approaching our craft, we will make better products. And I'm going to stand up here and I'm going to say something slightly controversial, but I won't break the code of conduct, not that kind of controversial. And it's that for all the work that we do, we don't get hired to code. There's not a single person in this room that is employed to code. We get hired to build products. That's what we do. We support the benefit that data is going to give to a user. We provide features that give those users benefit. And ultimately, our products generate revenue for our companies. Revenue turns into our paychecks. And let's face it, while we care about our craft and we care about the creativity, we also care about getting paid. So you should care. Approach makes better approach makes better products. And I should care because I decided to be brave and talk about this, so I have to care about it. Let's talk a little bit about Mozart. This is your history lesson for the morning. Mozart was born in 1756, lived until 1791. For those of you that are doing the math, that means he died at about 35, 36 years of age. So he had a very short life. Most of the things that you've heard about him are true. Don't pay attention to the movie Amadeus. It's completely farcical. But he was absolutely a virtuoso of his time. He was a child prodigy. He was composing his first opera at the age of 5. He was performing in public at the age of 4, like huge salon performances where hundreds of people would come to listen to him play. He was absolutely the rock star of his time. And interestingly, in his very short life, he composed a tremendous body of work. By the time he died, he had over 600 completed works. That is prolific in a way that we can't fathom, really, as developers. If I was to ask for a show of hands, I doubt any of you would be able to raise your hand and say that you have 600 completed products that you have built in your lifetime. And these are 600 products that are out in the marketplace that people are consuming and using and other people are being inspired by. And this is just a short list of what he was able to contribute in his lifetime. I mean, 22 operas, those are huge. And he wrote 22 of them and had 2 more that were unfinished on top of that. I'm 44, I got pants on this morning. Like, that's my accomplishment, and trust me, I'm happy about that. Like, thank you, right. So what I wanted to find was taking the example of someone like Mozart, who's famous for being very prolific and having tons and tons of works that he was able to complete. I wanted to figure out how I could hack my productivity. If I could use someone like Mozart or Bach or Beethoven or any of the great masters of music and look at how they built their products. Look at how they approached their craft and see if there was something that I could learn from it in order to make me a better developer. I mean, I build JavaScript all the time. I know several languages. I've been around the block, not my first rodeo. But I wanted to get better. I always want to get better. And so I started to look at what approach they were using, specifically Mozart being so prolific, what approach they were using that I could be inspired by. And I had to ask myself, what does it have to do with code? And initially, there wasn't a lot that was forthcoming. Because while a lot has been written about Mozart's life, nobody really sat down and interviewed him, Barbara Walters style, to figure out what made him tick back in 1780 or something like that. We didn't have TMZ following around with pictures, so it was a little bit harder to figure out. So I had to do just a bit of analysis based on what I knew and what I could find, and there were a couple things that came out that allowed me to take lessons of Mozart's life and apply them to code. And the first, the biggest, was structure. One of the things that Mozart is absolutely famous for is the structure of his music. He pretty much defined the classical period of music, much to the chagrin of many other composers of that age. Mozart was seen as the paradigm. Very much, we might look at, say, Dan Abramov's Egghead tutorials as the paradigm of how to learn Redux. Although I know all of you have that perfect blog post that explains it way better than he does. It's not like he wrote it or anything. But structure was important to Mozart. And our apps have structure. I can put up this diagram and we can all trace through it and see, there's a service, okay, we've got cloud storage, we've got external thing for sessions. We understand the workflow here, but we're very careful about building structures like this. Whether it is just a simple web app, even like a one-pager in Express, whether it is a complex, bordering on complicated, distributed microservice architecture and everything that would go into that, our apps have a very definite structure. In fact, the structures that we use, we tend to call them design patterns, and that can go from everything like the async ifs that Jonathan was talking about yesterday, ternaries, all the way up to entire app structure like this. Well, musicians, composers particularly, have a structure to their music. The one that Mozart was famous for perfecting was what's called the Sonata Allegro form. And I promise that you looking at this is the same effect that musicians have when they look at this. But this is a very particular form that most of the music that Mozart wrote follows. In fact, the piece that we listened to earlier, if we were to listen to the whole thing, and this was a music theory class, and I had 4 hours of your life that I could put into analyzing it, we would be able to break down very easily onto this diagram that piece of music. Once you've heard it a couple times, you almost can't unhear it. The exposition, the development, the recapitulation, they're very obvious as structure of the music. We envision our applications as whole systems. A lot of times we're responsible for one small piece of it. A lot of times we're responsible for architecting the entire broad whole, but we see them as whole systems, but they have structures inside of them. This is the structure of a fugue. I'm going to go back 75 years further in musical history to Johann Sebastian Bach, 1685 to 1750, not that you care. Bach was famous for the fugue, which is 4 completely independent lines, anywhere from 2 to 5 actually, but 4 completely independent lines of music, 4 different melodies being played together at the same time to form a whole new piece of music. Sounds a lot like concurrency, asynchronous operations, parallel processing, a lot of the things that we would have in our applications on a daily basis. Second big piece was approach. Structure matters. Okay, I know I need to focus on the structure, but then I need to think about the approach. How am I going to think about my application, my product, my composition before I write it? And I realized that I had to look at it the same way structurally that a musician would look at a piece of music. And musicians, especially since a lot of you have experience, we have 2 ways of thinking. We have the horizontal, our melody, and we have the vertical, which is our harmony. So horizontally, how can I think about things? And one of the quotes that's great comes from Edward de Bono, and 1967, so it's even older than I am. But he talks about how lateral thinking is stepping to one side, laterally, and thinking about something in an unconventional way. Taking steps to solve a problem that you may not have otherwise thought were the straightforward way to solve a problem. We've all had that moment. Typically, we call it, being clever or mad hacks or one of those terms that justifies us doing something that might be a little bit unconventional. Mozart did this all the time. Melodically, in Mozart's works, he did things that were considered unconventional for the time, but now are considered absolutely 100% standard. Iffies, when they first came out, when we first started seeing this pattern emerge, it was considered unconventional and wild and, cowboy coding. And yes, I just did finger guns. But they were, that was an example of lateral thinking being applied to the craft of building a piece of music. This is actually the written out music for what you just listened to a few minutes ago. And there is a very definite horizontal flow. The melody of a piece of music is the horizontal flow of that music. When we're thinking about that progressing over time, this becomes a timeline as much as it does just a direction that the music is going. This is music borrowed from the theme of a very popular TV show which involves dragons and a lot of naked people, whose name I won't say for copyright reasons, but it rhymes with Reign of Bones. And there's a couple things that are really interesting in this piece of music, and for those of you that can read music notation, you're probably humming it in your head. But I've taken the liberty of applying a couple of carefully placed green arrows to show that even the structure of this music is designed to move it forward. The melody is actually designed to have you feeling that anticipation. It's almost like when we build, a tour on an app that we've just built, and we're trying to draw that user in, or when we monetize a landing page and have calls to action that are going to draw the user forward. There is a pattern here of thinking horizontally through time and what is going to move our listener to a piece of music or our user in a web application, what is going to move them forward in time. Algorithms, a very wise, humble man who I won't name, though I will say that he is bald and charming and incredibly handsome, came up with this quote in the middle of the night one night, but algorithms are the melodies of an application. And this was my aha moment. This was my aha moment where I could say, this is that crux where the parallels really start to click together. the steps that we take to process the data that we are giving our users access to, those are the steps that move forward in time, like the individual notes that I would put into a melody to have it move forward in time. Our algorithms are the melodies of our app. When we're thinking horizontally as a developer, we'll take Robin as a user. Robin's going to click a link. That's going to send a GET request from the client. Client's going to hit the server. Server's going to make an API call, maybe to some popular service that serves up JSON data very nicely. That API is going to return some data. We might take that and send it into something like Watson in order to analyze it. And the server is going to get data back from Watson, build a response, and it's going to send it back to Robin. This is a horizontal progression of steps that we can follow, very similar to how we might follow the melody of a piece of music. FizzBuzz is another great example. We all know how FizzBuzz works, and if you don't, well, it's the worst tech interview question ever. You just need to memorize 10 ways to do it that are all in one line in different languages, and then just regurgitate it when you go for an interview. But this is a perfect example of how we have a very linear set of steps that we follow, even though there's some conditional branches in there, but there's a very linear progression over time that leads us from one point to another, from problem to solution. So as our code moves from one step to another, the thinking that fuels our solutions is linear, it is horizontal, and a lot of times, in the best cases, when we are doing something unconventional that maybe hasn't been done before, it's lateral. But let's talk about the vertical now, that other axis. We call it a stack. We vertically arrange the components of our applications, and we call it a stack. When we have words like that, queue, stack, tree, these are words that we might use every day, and they have multiple meanings depending on whether I'm pointing at, a maple tree in Vancouver, Canada, or whether I am, pointing at a directory structure, for example. But we call it a stack because there is a vertical relationship. In this case, Ember or React or Vue or whatever your drug of choice is for building your front end is going to talk to Node. Node's going to talk to Postgres. That's all sitting inside of a Docker container running on a Linux server somewhere. And I'm not even counting in the network layer here for how we're connecting to that. But it's a stack, and it's very vertical. We code vertically as well as horizontally. All of these different techniques here that we might use have to do at any moment in time. There's an entire relationship of our application and our data at that moment in time. If at any click, at any debug step, if we were putting breakpoints on every single line of our code, there's a vertical relationship that we have there with the different technologies that we brought in. And the interesting part about that is that becomes one of the ways that we have a challenge as developers. Our challenge is to have our work be ignored. When I talked about sitting down and using an application that had a great amount of craft to it, ideally, the user should forget that someone sat down and typed that all out. The user should forget that someone had to debug and ended up screaming at their computer. The user should forget, whether we were rubber ducking to solve that problem or whether it took a stand-up scrum of 10 minutes. The user doesn't care. Ideally, the user should never have to think about the work that we put into our application. We're building experiences for them. We're building products for them. Our problem solving and our vertical architecture should be transparent. When we have DNS problems or Cloudflare goes down or, GitHub is down for whatever reason, there are a lot of things that happen. The DNS outage that happened in Eastern North America a couple months ago. When things like that happen, it affects our users, but our ultimate goal is that they should never, ever notice. Musicians have it just as hard, unfortunately. This is a bit of music from the Mozart Violin Concerto. I've taken the liberty of applying some green lines to where the beats of the music are. As a musician, especially if you are a soloist, you have to make sure that as you are playing, the meter of your music, the meter of the melody that you're playing lines up with your accompaniment. You don't just go off on your merry way and hope that they catch up. The same way that we wouldn't want our React app to just go off and start processing things and making assumptions about data without ever actually querying the server for it. That would be bad. Similarly, when we're thinking vertically as a musician, we have the concept of harmony. Basically, are we in tune? So I've circled an E-flat major chord here. If you don't know what that is, smile and nod. But the soloist on the top line there has to make sure that that B-flat that they are playing is going to be in tune with the rest of the ensemble. You've probably all at one point or another had to go to your niece's or nephew's grade 6 band concert or something like that, and you had that moment of just cringing because of the way it sounded, even though you were proud of them for what they were able to accomplish, of course. But tuning and being in harmony matters. And so this was where my second aha happened in thinking about this. And it comes from this quote, "In tune, on time." This quote comes from a gentleman named Dr. Frederick Fennell, who was a very famous conductor in the United States. He was the master of bands and orchestras at Indiana University. He was about this tall. He was a vicious little beast of a man, but he was a brilliant musician. And I had the privilege of performing under his baton once, and we were having a particularly hard day in rehearsal, and he put down his baton and he said, "Okay, I just want you to understand one thing. The process of making music is very simple." And he said, let me draw an analogy for baseball. And baseball being the, quote, sport of America and all of that, terrible way to spend an afternoon, but good beer and bad hot dogs. He made an analogy to baseball players. And he said baseball players are paid millions of dollars a year to hit 1/3 of the pitches that are thrown to them. If they are exceptional, they're hitting .333. And he said musicians, on the average, are barely paid minimum wage to play 100% of the notes that are put in front of them. This was the aha moment, as I remembered this quote. And so what he said was, musicians, all we have to do to be successful is we have to play in tune on time. If we can do that, the music will be beautiful. Everything after that is just making music. This is all the technique you ever need. And so I got to thinking about that, and I got to thinking about this in tune on time idea when it comes to my applications. And so I asked myself, can we apply that mentality to development? Can we strip away a lot of the complexity that we tend to add to the process and the approach of building an application? And can we apply this mentality? And of course, another famous quote came to mind, so I had to use that one. And yes, we can. Obama got elected on these 3 words, that and Twitter. But if I'm looking at musicians versus developers and how this in tune on time idea applies, musicians tell a story. Art is how we decorate space. Music is how we decorate time. And a performer is stringing together notes and melodies stacked on top of harmonies. But developers are offering solutions. We are building products. We're giving access to data that benefits users through our implementation. So an algorithm implemented into an architecture creates a product. And so now, a good user experience, I can define this by drawing these parallels and saying a good user experience is one where the app runs in tune on time, when it just works for the user, when our approach has been to use the lateral thinking, to be aware of the structure, the underlying architecture of our application, to be very aware of that algorithm that's progressing from start to finish. And if we can get our apps to run in tune on time, then we're going to have fantastic products. I do have a shameless plug. Please feel free to buy my book. I just published a book about project planning, putting a lot of these ideas into place. I'm very opinionated. No surprise, I'm a developer. And I'd love to see these ideas getting shared because I think they make a huge difference in the way I approach applications now. And that's all I have to talk about to you today. Thank you very much.